Ellen DeGeneres stopped mid-sentence, staring at the 15-year-old sitting across from her, with an intensity that seemed to carry the weight of the world. Maya Chen's dark eyes held something Ellen had rarely seen in someone so young, a fierce determination mixed with a heartbreaking awareness that time was running out. What happened in the next 60 seconds would become more than television. It would become the moment when youth activism met Hollywood power, and the future of our planet got a fighting chance. Nobody in that Warner Bros. Studio knew they were about to witness something that would change environmental policy. Not the cameras rolling, not the producers checking their carbon footprint calculations for the first time that day, and certainly not Maya Chen, who thought she was just there to talk about her small school campaign that had somehow gone viral. But Ellen knew. Ellen had been planning this moment for 6 weeks, ever since a video had made her call someone whose life's mission aligned perfectly with this teenager's urgent message. The video was shot on a phone outside the California state capitol. In it, Maya Chen, small for her age but commanding attention through sheer passion, was speaking to a crowd of adults about something most of them didn't want to hear, that their children's futures were being stolen by their present choices. But what made the video go viral wasn't just her environmental facts, delivered with scientific precision that would make any college professor proud. It was the moment at the end when she looked directly into the camera and said, "I'm 15 years old and I shouldn't have to beg adults to care about the world I'll inherit. But if begging is what it takes, then I'll beg." But this is where the story gets extraordinary. Because Leonardo DiCaprio had seen that video, Ellen had seen that video, and what they decided to do about it would amplify not just Maya's voice, but the voices of young activists around the world who were fighting for a future that was rapidly slipping away. Now, as Maya sat in that familiar blue chair wearing a simple cardigan made from recycled materials, everything she owned was either thrifted or sustainably made. She had no idea that her environmental hero was watching backstage, equally amazed by this teenager's scientific knowledge and moral clarity. Ellen leaned forward, her characteristic energy focused by genuine concern. "Maya, you're 15 years old, but you speak about climate change like a scientist who's been studying it for decades. Where does that knowledge come from?" Maya straightened slightly, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone who had learned that facts were her only weapon against adult dismissal. "When you know that the world you're inheriting is in crisis, Ellen, you study. I've read every IPCC report, every peer-reviewed study I can access. I've learned that my generation has about 7 years to fundamentally change how we live, or we won't have a livable planet." The studio audience was already captivated, but not in the usual entertained way. This was different. This was education wrapped in urgency, delivered by someone who would live with the consequences of every decision being made today. "Tell me about your campaign at school. How did a high school student convince an entire district to go plastic-free?" Maya's face lit up with the kind of satisfaction that comes from small victories in a massive war. "It started when I calculated how much single-use plastic our school was using every day. 2,847 plastic items, every single day. I presented the data to the administration, but they said it was too expensive to change." Ellen felt something stir in her chest. Here was a teenager who had done the research, crunched the numbers, and been dismissed by adults who should have been listening. "So what did you do?" "I organized the students. We started bringing our own reusable everything, water bottles, utensils, lunch containers. Within a month, our plastic consumption dropped by 80% just from student action. The administration couldn't ignore the data anymore." Maya reached into her recycled canvas bag and pulled out a thick folder. "This is my documentation. Photos, charts, waste audit results. When adults tell me I'm too young to understand the problem, I show them this. Data doesn't have an age." Ellen was studying Maya's face, seeing something she recognized from her most impactful interviews, someone who had found their purpose early and was pursuing it with singular focus. "Maya, what drives you to fight so hard for this? What makes a 15-year-old give up normal teenage activities to become an environmental activist?" For the first time, Maya's scientific composure cracked slightly. "Because normal teenage activities won't matter if there's no future to have them in. Ellen, I see pictures of what my parents' generation had: clean air, stable weather, abundant wildlife. I see what we have now: wildfire smoke, extreme weather, mass extinction. And I see what we're heading toward." Her voice grew stronger, more urgent. "Adults ask me why I'm not just enjoying being a kid. But how can I enjoy being a kid when I know that by the time I'm 30, the world might be unrecognizable? How can I worry about prom when I should be worrying about whether there will be coral reefs for my children to see?" The silence in the studio was profound. This wasn't teenage drama. This was a young person grappling with existential reality in a way that most adults avoided thinking about. But Ellen wasn't just listening as a talk show host anymore. She was listening as someone who was about to facilitate a conversation between this remarkable young activist and someone who had dedicated his post-acting career to the same fight, someone who had the resources and platform to amplify Maya's message to the world. "Maya," Ellen said, standing up from her chair, "there's someone here who's been watching your videos for weeks. Someone who has spent the last 15 years of his life fighting the same fight you're fighting, with the same urgency, the same passion." Maya looked confused, hope and disbelief flickering across her face. "Someone who fights for the environment." Ellen walked toward the wings of the stage, and the studio audience began to buzz with anticipation. They could sense something significant was about to happen. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ellen announced, her voice carrying across the studio with unusual gravity, "please welcome someone who has turned his platform into a force for environmental change, Leonardo DiCaprio." The studio exploded. 300 people jumped to their feet, but this wasn't typical celebrity excitement. This was recognition of someone who had used his fame for something bigger than entertainment. Ellen was watching Maya, who had gone completely still. Her mouth fell open. Her hands gripped her folder of research, and then tears started flowing down her face. Leonardo DiCaprio walked onto that stage carrying himself with the focused intensity of someone who had sat in boardrooms with world leaders, who had funded documentaries that changed policy, who understood that celebrity meant responsibility. He wasn't carrying his movie star charisma, he was carrying something more powerful, the presence of someone on a mission. "Maya," Leo said, his voice carrying that distinctive warmth that had made him beloved, but with an undertone of environmental urgency. "I've been watching your work for months, and I've got something to tell you. You're not just a student activist, you're one of the most effective environmental advocates I've ever seen." Maya couldn't speak. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face, staring at the man whose environmental documentaries had inspired her to start her own activism, whose foundation had funded research she cited in her presentations. But this is where the story becomes something nobody expected. Something that would change not just Maya's impact, but how the world thought about youth environmental leadership, about the responsibility that comes with having a platform, about the urgency of listening to the generation that will inherit the climate crisis. Leo didn't sit down. Instead, he knelt beside Maya's chair, bringing himself to her level, a gesture that spoke volumes about how he saw this conversation. Not adult to child, but activist to activist. "Maya, can I tell you something? I've been fighting climate change for 15 years. I've met with presidents, funded research, produced documentaries, but in all that time, I've never seen anyone of any age present environmental data as clearly and urgently as you do." The studio audience was completely silent now, watching two people, one a global superstar, one a teenager, connect over the shared knowledge that the planet was in crisis. What you've accomplished at your school, the way you've organized your generation, the scientific rigor you bring to activism, that's exactly what the movement needs. But Maya, you shouldn't have to fight this alone. Leo reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made Maya gasp. It was a printed copy of her school's waste audit report, but it had been annotated with notes and signatures. "I shared your waste audit with environmental scientists at my foundation. They want to use your methodology as a model for schools worldwide. Your approach, combining scientific rigor with student organizing, is revolutionary." But Leo wasn't finished. He looked at Ellen, who nodded, then back at Maya. "Maya, speaking at your school is important work, but I want to help you reach the world. I'm inviting you to join the board of the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation's Youth Initiative, not as a token young person, but as a lead strategist." The audience was holding its breath, sensing something historic was happening. "But more than that," Leo continued, his voice dropping to something more personal, more urgent, "I want you to be my co-presenter at the next UN Climate Summit. World leaders need to hear your voice, your data, your urgency. They need to understand that this isn't about future generations anymore. It's about your generation, right now." Maya started crying harder, but they were tears of overwhelming validation, of dreams she hadn't dared to voice suddenly becoming reality. "And Maya," Leo continued, "I'm establishing a new fund specifically for youth-led environmental initiatives. $50 million to support young activists like you who are fighting for the future they'll have to live in." The studio erupted, but this wasn't just applause for a generous gesture. This was recognition of something rare, an adult with power choosing to follow the leadership of young people who understood the stakes better than anyone. Ellen stepped forward, her own face reflecting the magnitude of what had just happened. You know what, folks? This is exactly why we do this show, not just for entertainment, but for moments like this. Moments when we remember that the people with the most at stake often have the clearest vision of what needs to be done. She turned to Maya, who was still holding her research folder like a shield. Maya, you said you shouldn't have to beg adults to care about your future. You're right. Adults should be following your lead. And today, one of the most influential people in environmental activism just said he wants to amplify your voice to the world. The show ended with Maya, Ellen, and Leo in a three-way embrace, but the image that would be shared millions of times was simpler. Leonardo DiCaprio kneeling beside a 15-year-old activist, both of them understanding that the fight for the planet's future was too important for ego, too urgent for traditional hierarchies. 6 months later, Maya Chen addressed the UN Climate Summit alongside Leonardo DiCaprio. Her presentation on youth-led environmental action was viewed by world leaders from 19 countries. 3 countries immediately implemented her school waste audit methodology nationwide. But more importantly, her voice had joined the global conversation not as a token young person, but as a recognized expert. The $50 million fund Leo established has supported over 200 youth-led environmental initiatives across 6 continents. Maya serves as its primary advisor, reviewing proposals from young activists worldwide who are fighting for their future with the same urgency she brought to her own school. But the real transformation wasn't just in Maya's platform, it was in the recognition that young people weren't just the future of environmental activism, they were its present leadership. Adults weren't just listening to youth voices, they were following them. Ellen keeps a photo from that day in her dressing room, Leo kneeling beside Maya, both of them crying, both of them understanding that the planet's future depended on bridging the gap between those with power and those with the most at stake. Every time she looks at it, she remembers that her platform's highest purpose isn't entertainment, it's elevation. Leo continues his environmental work, but now as part of a movement increasingly led by young voices. Maya taught me that experience isn't just about how long you've been fighting, he said in a recent interview. Sometimes the people who see most clearly are those who have the most to lose, and Maya. She still carries that folder of research, but now it's accompanied by policy briefings from world governments, collaboration requests from international organizations, and letters from young activists worldwide who've been inspired to start their own environmental campaigns. The cardigan she wore that day, made from recycled materials, has been retired, replaced by clothes appropriate for addressing world leaders, but she keeps it as a reminder of the 15-year-old who refused to accept adult indifference to her future, because that's what Leonardo DiCaprio, Ellen DeGeneres, and Maya Chen taught the world that day, that the climate crisis isn't a future problem, it's a present emergency, that the people most qualified to lead the fight are those who will live with the consequences longest, and that when adults with power choose to amplify youth voices instead of dismissing them, real change becomes possible. The plastic waste audit that started Maya's activism has now been implemented in over 1,000 schools worldwide, but more importantly, it proved that young people weren't just the leaders of tomorrow, they were the leaders their planet needed today. Share this story if you believe young voices deserve to be heard. Comment below if you've ever felt too young to make a difference. And remember, the future isn't something that happens to you, it's something you create, one urgent action at a time. Because in the end, that's what happened in that studio that day. A teenager who refused to inherit a broken planet became a voice for millions, all because 2 adults chose to see her not as a child with opinions, but as a leader with solutions. The world Maya is fighting for is the world we all share, and her fight, it turns out, is everyone's fight. It just took a 15-year-old to remind the adults what's at stake.